please join me in welcoming to the virtual CMX Summit stage, Dr. Seanelle Hawkins.
Thank you. I am excited to be here. Thank you, Beth.
Welcome, Dr. Hawkins. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. And thank you to the CMX team for the invitation to speak with you today. I have the pleasure of serving as the president and CEO of the Urban League of Rochester, and it's my honor to serve as the first woman in this role. The Urban League of Rochester was founded in 1965 in the wake of racial unrest and riots that devastated the Rochester community. Interestingly, in 2020, as a nation, we found ourselves back in the center of protests and racial tensions plagued by two pandemics, COVID-19 and systemic racism. I'm here to tell you that we have work to do. And this conversation is for everyone. I'm going to call out some specific groups, but I submit to you, for us to move the needle on racism, we all have work to do. Because there is a long history of practices that were designed about labor, making money, gaining land, schemes designed to divide and conquer, and systems of support and wealth building that left Black and Indigenous people of color out of the scenario. Even poor white people were left out too. This plan was designed about making money and free labor and a system of wealth, labor, and class. There were policies and norms and beliefs that worked together to advantage whites while producing adverse outcomes for Black people and people of color. So for the white people in the audience, we need you. We know that you worked hard to get where you are, and things may not have come easy for you. You may have even grown up in poverty. But what we need you to understand is that your race was not one of the issues that held you back. No one is asking you to give us anything. We just need to create access for everyone. So for sustainable change to take place, it's going to require deep level systems change, much more than a flag, a solidarity statement. We need an action plan. We need a turnaround. We must employ a plan that moves the community beyond surface level change. Deep level system change is what must be sought for us to move the needle on racism and systemic practices. Let me explain the system. So there are many systems. There's the education system, the banking and lending system, judicial system, housing system, real estate system, immigration system. All of these systems are connected and they're interlocked. For example, policies in the banking and lending system impact the housing system. So if banks don't lend to certain groups, let me be more specific, Black people that want to live in suburban areas, and the banks will only lend to Blacks in specific areas. This is called redlining. This is how we create neighborhoods plagued by poverty. If impoverished neighborhoods have students all zoned to the same school, this impacts the school. If school funding is connected to collected taxes and homes in the school district have less value, less taxes, then there's less funding for that school. See how it's interconnected? Poorer outcomes, inequities, disparities. Racial inequity looks the same across every system, and it looks the same, but we use these different names to call them out. And so instead of saying poor outcomes, we say things like racial disparities in health, the achievement gap in education, disproportionality, racial and ethnic disparity, historically underserved businesses. Yet all these same names describe the same thing, poor outcomes. Now, this is where we need to ask the questions of why. So let me share my slides, and let me share a story with you. It's a fable. So I heard this story that really made me think about my own role in these systems. So come with me for a second. I'm going to go to the next slide. One day you're swimming with your friends, and all of a sudden, a baby comes from upstream. The baby is coming downstream fast, and you catch the baby. As soon as you catch the baby, your friend grabs a towel and dries the baby. As soon as that baby is dry, another baby comes downstream. You catch that baby, give the baby to your friend, The friend drives the baby, and as soon as you look up, another baby comes downstream. And then you call another friend because she can't hold on to the babies. And you really need someone to help you find where the babies can live. Now you have this cycle of saving babies, drying babies, housing babies, and no one had time to look up to see where the heck are the babies coming from. We just were thinking about being more efficient. So if we go to the next slide. So now we have 4 new businesses, all to save the babies. We're so busy growing and saving babies. No one has had the time to figure out what is going on. Why are these babies coming downstream? This story made me stop and think. We can go to the next slide. How many nonprofits are just saving babies? Let me go back to the slide, the previous slide. It really made me stop and think, how many nonprofits are just saving babies and have no time to look up to find where the babies are coming from? In fact, when I reflect on the story, I thought, we've just created a business of saving babies, getting bigger, growing, and no time to understand where the babies are coming from. And I thought about how many nonprofits have had in their strategic plan to look up and to solve the problem. Even businesses. I come from a nonprofit perspective, so I'm sharing that. But in fact, I've been working in nonprofits for more than 18 years, and I've never been in a meeting that asked, are we going to fulfill the mission this year? So this is different thinking. So I want to close some nonprofits in the next 10 to 15 years so that we can fulfill the mission. But it's going to require some investment. Investment from you, from banks, from for-profits, from individuals, from organizations. We are going to have to invest in this work of looking up. This requires deep systems change, mission work. Okay, so I told you that this conversation was for everyone. For us to move the needle on racism, we are going to have to do much more than solidarity statements, anti-racist challenges, one-off community conversations about race. They have their place, but this movement requires investment in learning, unlearning, and a concerted effort for change and employing a change strategy. This means that attitudinal shifts must occur. It involves interpersonal learning, developing a coalition, your network to guide the work, and most importantly, implementation of a successful change model. So to all the allies and individuals, and even you have to consider yourself to be change leaders, or what we call interrupters. We need interrupters to interrupt racism. The Urban League recommends that the community analyze the dismantling of racism as a turnaround. And we know turnaround from the business community. These are business practices. Remember, racism is a business practice, and we have to interrupt it, and it requires a turnaround strategy. So to get to that end state of interrupting racism, you can only achieve it by a successful strategic action. So let me just share with you, we'll go to the next slide, that not all individuals will find that their personal goals are congruent with the journey towards dismantling racism and being an anti-racist. So some may decide not to become interruptive. However, once an individual decides to move forward with becoming an interrupter and implement an interruption change strategy, that's where the work begins. And we believe that there's a 4-stage process to dismantling racism. And so what you see on the screen is stage 1, and this is where the work begins. Each individual, or interrupter as we call you, begins at stage 1. And this is where they gain personal confidence and benefit from the support work of a network of other interrupters. Gaining confidence and support from other interrupters or equity officers or people more engaged in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work will help support the individual in leading an effort. So as you're gaining confidence and fortifying yourself, you're staying connected to developments regarding race, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice initiative. And that's essential to the interruption process. So on the next slide is stage 2, accessing resources. This is the second stage of the four-stage interruption model. So illustrated at the center of this figure, at this stage, the interrupter will access formal and informal resources or a combination of the two to prepare for the final stage of the interruption. So at this stage, the interrupter, or you, may attend group meetings and read articles about racism and diversity, equity, inclusion, justice efforts. Also, you can seek formal training by attending a conference, the summit like today, a college course, or engage with a consultant or a diversity, equity, inclusion officer. Now, formal resources differ from informal resources in that they often define expectations. They detail your outcomes and determine specific expectations for each individual. So on the next slide, you'll see the third stage. This third stage is leading others. So illustrated in this outer circle, the interrupter will lead others. So after you've gained the confidence, you gained more knowledge through formal and informal resources, building self-confidence, the interrupter is going to utilize those competencies to lead others, to develop new interrupters, to educate their networks, their coalition, develop shared goals, and provide information about the action steps necessary to create sustainable change. So the interrupter, again, that's you. You'll provide your network training and support, the things that you've learned. You'll provide that support to your network through your relationships, and you'll begin to change attitudes and help others to build and develop and become interrupters. And this is going to positively shift ideas on racism. Now, the interrupter, or you're going to guide your network in understanding the urgency of moving from complacency and attitudes about this is how we've always done it to a culture of accountability and action steps for change. However, on the next slide, you will see the final stage. And this is where the work begins. This is the interruption. It demonstrates how the interrupters, you, utilize the skills gained in the previous stages to inform the targeted systems that need systemic change. The interrupters will utilize their skills gained in the former stages, and that was preparing self, accessing resources, and leading others through its application. The interrupter and their network focuses the interruption on specific areas targeted. Now, here you're going to see 5 areas that are identified, and that was from our interrupt racism data. And so there were 5 areas that we identified in Rochester, and we developed an interrupt racism report to the community. And so those 5 areas were education, health, policing, housing, employment, and jobs. But the 5 areas depicted in the picture represent the systems targeted for change here in Rochester, and its connection to preparing self, accessing resources, and leading others. But this model provides flexibility in that the outer legs can be increased or decreased. It could be just one, depending on the systems that you want for improvement. For example, if you wanted to interrupt in your organization, the interruption could be policies or recruitment practices. The unlabeled boxes depicted in the figure that you see on your screen illustrate the flexibility in the model in the interruption stage. So now preparing self, accessing resources, and leading others are critical, and they don't provide that same flexibility. You still have to go through that process. So as I wrap up, the preparing self and accessing resources stages will support the interrupter in developing capabilities and strategy. In the leading others stage, the interrupter influences their network and develops others to develop a shared vision and to achieve that desired change, whatever that interruption is that you've designed. But the end goal will be dismantling systemic racist practices. So we can all be the interruption. We need collective power, collective action. This happens when our groups, your network, begin to take actions on problems that we recognize, and we work strategically to get to the root cause and to ask the why. So I know you're asking, I don't see it in the chat, but what do we do now? But we can't, one thing we can't do is have performative action. We need real change. So I know you're asking what I can do. One, you can commit to recognizing your own biases, whether they're hidden or overt. You can talk about racism at your table, your home table. You can look at inequities in your organization, in your community, in your businesses. Ask questions like, are we welcoming everyone? This is not a zero-sum game. Everyone can win. Everyone can win. Remember, I told you that these were practices about slavery and making money, and they were all about economic mobility for some and not for others. And the end goal should be our work is to create economic mobility for all. So you can do your personal work. You can do your work by checking your biases, check your friends, read some books, attend a workshop, learn how your biases and practices have impacted your decisions. Doing your work leads to better decisions, better communities. And what systemic racist practices are holding up in your organizations? You want to know what systemic racist practices you are personally or your organization is upholding. Sometimes we don't think about these things. You don't ask the question, what does my board look like? What about our executive team? Do we have some work to do there? Once you do that work, inform your network, share what you learn, you have to get the message out. We have to interrupt old practices. We have to help others understand how their practices feed systemic racism. Next, I encourage you to partner with your local urban league or organization that is working to attack systems of racism. And ask the why questions to change the old policies. Remember that fable. You've got to ask the why. So let's work collectively. Let's pool our resources to create more home ownership, better schools, move people out of poverty, create affordable housing, open doors for entrepreneurship, and let's achieve economic mobility for all. So I need you all to do something. Share the message. Do your work, create an action plan. If you need support for this journey, you can call the Urban League of Rochester. You can check us out at the Urban League of Rochester RLC, or just go to interruptracism.com and you'll see resources, a toolkit. But most importantly, let's get to the root cause. I thank you for listening. And if you want to learn more, the next slide is an example of a formal resource. And so we have our Interrupt Racism Summit, which is really exciting. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. And here we have 6 keynotes. Most notably, we have Michelle Williams of Destiny's Child. We have Harriet Washington, who's written the book Medical Apartheid. Mark Morial, who is the National Urban League leader. We have some notable speakers, but there will be more than 20 workshops to help you do your work and understand what that work is. On the next slide, we invite you to bring your entire team and learn more about it. And if you really want to dig deep, on the next slide, you can learn more about our 12-month program. And this is where individuals can join a cohort. Right now, we have a cohort of 22 organizations. And this is a mix of nonprofits, for-profits, foundations, colleges, in a cohort committed to interrupting racism. And they're going on a guided 12-month journey with the Urban League. Now, the Urban League of Rochester is not the only organization doing work like this. So I encourage you, as you think about what your work is, connect with organizations that are your formal resources so that you can begin to do this work. If you'd like to connect, on the next slide, it provides how we can connect. I'll drop my contact information in the chat. And you can find me on LinkedIn. But I'm most grateful for this opportunity for you to listen and learn more about how you can interrupt racism, be an interrupter, be an anti-racist. And this has been my absolute honor. And Beth, if there's time, I'd love to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Seanelle. That was Excellent. And I will say that there are a couple questions, and there are a lot of really positive comments. Alex says, this was the single most impactful session I attended during this summit. So I feel like if that
Thank you,
doesn't sum it
Alex.
up.
I appreciate that.
I'll also read out Tiffany Avery's comment. This is where non-BIPOC interrupters are so necessary. Following these stages allow non-BIPOC and, of course, BIPOC to be allies in ways that will resonate in their network in a different way that may allow the network to feel more comfortable. So
This is
there's just
everyone's work. Thank you. This is everyone's work. This is all of us have work to do, and this model does just that. Shows you how to do that. So thank you.
Okay, we do have some questions and we have some time, so I'm excited for that. Eric Rentz Whitmore asks, are there ways you've seen community group leaders making a difference around systemic racism in your area or nationally? And can you share lessons learned?
Absolutely. One of the things that I've seen in Rochester is that we're breaking down silos. And let me explain this a bit more. Organizations and group have just been doing their pockets of work in their own areas, and that's not going to be effective. Coming together, having those conversations, and figuring out how to work together is one thing that I've seen. I've also seen the city government put together a report. It's called the Race Report that really analyzes what's happening in the community. And the report, it was more than 600 pages. But even though that was overwhelming, what was great that came from it is it empowered the community to say, what are you going to do? How are you going to lead this effort? What are you committed to taking on to be your charge? And I think that's the work that we have to do. It has to be collective action. We're not going to interrupt racism on our own. We have to do this work together.
Excellent. That is actually a really good segue into the next question I'd like to ask from Diane Yoon. What advice do you have for people who aren't marginalized but want to help so that they don't speak over BIPOC voices? How can they be an effective part of dismantling racism without overstepping?
This is a great question. Just the fact that you asked the question is important because one, do your work. Do your go through that first stage, do your personal work. But when you're at tables, especially if you're at tables and you don't see people of color at the table, use your voice to ask the question. Where's so and so? Why aren't they here? Who's representing this voice? And then when you hear that voices of color, people of color are not being heard, lift their voice. And then communities in your area that are doing this work, ask them, what can I do? It's just a simple question of asking and not assuming. And that's the work. But you're already ahead of the game because you're asking the question. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay, I have a question for you as well. What is the first step a community manager can take to implement DEI and B programming into their community?
The number one action step, and I know I didn't say it earlier, but is have a budget. Because if you don't have the money to support your actions, to follow it up, it's not going to be sustainable. So put together a budget to do this work because you don't want to do a one off. If you really want to do meaningful DEIJ, and that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work, you need some dollars to support that.
How do you make that claim? How do you ask for that kind of budget?
Yeah, I think it always comes from the top. It has to be the organizations, the CEO commitment, the executive team has to be committed. But I think everyone has to use their voice to say, this is important to us as an organization. And then there has to be a demand for dollars to support it. And as I said, it's going to take investment. This work does not come easy. It took us a long time to get here, and we have to undo and unlearn and relearn a lot of things. And so, with that, it's going to take some financial support and commitment.
I think you're right. And it's literally putting your money where your mouth is. We see a lot of Twitter, the banners behind company Twitter accounts and social media accounts changing their icons specifically for certain months. But like, if you're not putting your money where your mouth is, then that Twitter
Yeah.
icon isn't doing very much good, is it?
And those are what we just call the solidarity statements. You put it up for the month, it feels good, but are you doing the deep systems work inside your organization? Can BIPOC people ask questions and feel comfortable asking the deep questions about, hey, why does our executive team look the same? Why haven't we seen growth? What are some programs available to see advancement for BIPOC people?
And we have some time, so I will share my own experience, if that's okay, when we did our health survey in the CMX community earlier this year. And one of the questions we asked was, do you feel comfortable voicing your opinion in the CMX community? And when I first looked at that answer, it was really high, and everybody was like, yes, I feel very comfortable. The vast majority, I think it was like 85% of people said absolutely yes. And then we had a sometimes, and then we had a no, but the overwhelming majority said yes. And so I was kind of patting myself on the back. And then when we started to look at the cross tabs of data and actually see how people answered that question, and then how they also answered the demographic questions, where they live, how they identify, all sorts of different questions, we started to realize that a lot of the people who said they felt comfortable voicing their opinion are white, cis women, because that's the majority in the community industry. So that really was a bit of a shake on our own heads, in my head, to say, okay, I want to make sure everyone feels comfortable. And how do I make it so the next time we ask this question, more people from underrepresented groups are saying, yes, I feel comfortable voicing my opinion. So that's a real life example.
And I'm so glad you shared that story because it's a perfect example of how important data is. Because if you didn't dig deep and really analyze that data, you would have thought we're doing a great job. But when you really look at your data and see what those 3, 5%, what those folks said, who they were, it's really going to make you think differently. So use your data, look at your data, and begin to understand to do how you can do this work. And again, connect with the organization at the Urban League in our Interrupt Racism program. We walk organizations through this process. We guide them on the strategy. We help them to understand what work needs to be done, what their targeted areas, and help them understand that it's a process and it does take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but you have to understand what the issues are and be willing and committed to making that change.
Okay, back to questions here. We have one from Sarah Griesdorf. What advice do you have for white community managers who want to create spaces for community members of color to connect without taking up space for yourself?
Just what you said, invite them in and give them the space to do it. You're already there. That's awesome. Invite them in, learn what's happening, what are the issues, and create that in safe environment to learn. And I think that once you share your commitment, it's going to be a good process of unlearning and learning for your community. So great work.
Okay, this one is from Crux Conception. In your opinion, do you feel that BIPOC who are now just entering a workforce feel left out or feel that non-BIPOC don't welcome them? Does that make sense? I think that makes sense.
I think it makes sense. Thank you. I do think it makes sense, but I think that, depending on the area, I think that it's up to the leaders to look at the workforce to make sure that they're not leaving out, first of all, not hearing from everyone, getting everyone's voice. But you said you feel as if non-BIPOC people, repeat that question, Beth, because now I lost.
Yeah. So do you feel that BIPOC who are now entering a workforce feel left out or feel like non-BIPOC don't welcome them?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that there has to be, and it shouldn't be up to the employee. I think that the leadership has to encourage and find out how they create processes for inclusion. So hopefully, BIPOC people, as they're entering the workforce and organizations, they're finding that there are opportunities to use their voice so that they can lift their voice and share how they're feeling and what they like to see. And for those non-BIPOC individuals, I would encourage them to, use their power, their privilege, to make sure that there's an opportunity to hear from BIPOC people and create inclusion for everyone. And that's the work that we want to see. And that's when you get into the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you can create space, but does everyone feel included? Does everyone feel as if they belong? And make sure that we're lifting everyone's voice. So, Crux, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but hopefully I came at least a little bit.
Well, and it's worth mentioning. So William Rivera Bloodworth says that the next cohort application opens December 1st with a start date of February 1st. Can you talk a little bit about that, Seanelle?
Yeah. So at the interrupt racism cohort, that is a model that we use where we work, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, where we work with organizations on doing their interruption work. So maybe they're looking at recruitment practices, maybe they're looking at their policies and procedures, and we walk them through a guided 12-month journey with other organizations, and they come together twice a month virtually, so you can join from anywhere, and you do that work. You begin to do that work. You learn from your colleagues that are taking on. There are caucus groups where you can learn from and understand what are some of the issues that you may need to tackle. But it is a wonderful journey to get to the deep work that we have to do. So many of these questions, we begin to tackle them within our organization. We understand about power and position, but most importantly, we understand that strategy for DEIJ is important. You cannot do this work without a change strategy.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes for a couple more questions here. So David Spinks asks, how can people in positions of power balance being an ally without being a savior?
Do your work. Do your work and make room to listen. Be conscious of your voice. How are you using your voice? Sometimes when we sit in rooms and we hear when they're primarily white men, we have to, William is on, and we have a rule, but, making sure that, you're not overpowering your voices. Be conscious of how you use your voice. Are you making room? I like silence. When you're in a room, before you jump to speak up, just make room for silence so that others can lift their voice. Sometimes they don't lift their voice because they're so used to that other person speaking up. When we make room, when we begin to silence ourselves just a little bit, we make room for others, and you'll start to see that rise. And so I think that's important to say. But one, I don't think that there shouldn't be any savior mentality, that we all have work to do, but we need white people to go through this process, to do their work, to understand how they fortify themselves and understand what change strategies are necessary to make the changes so that we can mobilize, create economic mobility for all. But it has to be a concerted effort.
Okay, last question. Eden Brunson wonders if you have any suggestions for a team that's using almost entirely informal resources and trying to DIY DEI.
Eden, go to interruptracism.com. We have a toolkit there that's helpful and that'll be helpful. But I encourage you, it is hard to DIY DEI. It really is. You need as we share in the model, you need those formal resources because those are the people that are they're the experts and they're going to help you to do your work. And most importantly, this is how the real change, you have to put some money to it. So for a small investment of $2,500 or $3,000, you can get connected. Check out Interrupt Racism. We have tools. Give me a call. Connect with me on LinkedIn. We're here to help. But I am so happy that folks are interested in doing their work to interrupt racism. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seanelle Hawkins. Please join me in thanking Seanelle in the chat. That was so fantastic. You've definitely started a really important conversation, and I'm excited to see where this conversation goes.
Thank you. Thank you all for interrupting racism.